Amen. So you're there in 1 Samuel chapter 4. If you remember in chapter 3, this is where God calls out to Samuel and has to call out multiple times till he realizes that it's the Lord. But in this passage, if you remember in chapter 2, God sends a man of God to Eli to tell him that basically his house is done and his two sons are going to die. And then when God appears to Samuel, he says pretty much the same thing or repeats the same thing to Samuel. And so that's kind of where we end in chapter 3 is where Samuel ends up telling Eli what God told him about that. And chapter 4 is really where this is coming to fruition as far as the punishment that's being put on Eli's house. And in verse 1 here, we see that the word of Samuel came to all Israel. So if you remember that God was speaking in chapter 3, that it says the Lord appeared again in Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So at the beginning of chapter 3, the word of the Lord was precious in those days, meaning there was no open vision. But now he's coming to Samuel, and now Samuel is basically, the word of Samuel is coming to Israel. But at this point, we still have Eli. Eli's alive. Hophni and Phinehas are alive. But that's going to be coming to an end here in chapter 4. But in verse 1 there, as we keep reading, it says, Now Israel went out against the Philistines to battle and pitched beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines pitched in Aphek. And the Philistines put themselves in array against Israel. And when they joined battle, Israel was smitten before the Philistines, and they slew of the army in the field about 4,000 men. So if you get the picture, well, if you know the book of Judges, right, because we're still in the Judges, if you will, and the idea that we have Eli that judged for 40 years, it mentions in here, and that Samuel's also a judge in certain provinces. So we're still in the time of the Judges. There's no king at this point. And if you read the book of Judges, it's just like the Philistines, the Philistines, the Philistines, the Philistines. It's just, I mean, obviously the famous, if you remember anybody in Judges, you think of Samson. And the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. You know, the idea is the Philistines are like enemy number one when it comes to Israel. And it's still the case here. But they're going out to battle against the Philistines, and they end up getting defeated with 4,000 men dying. Now, they meet up in this place, or they pitch in Ebenezer. Now, I believe this place actually wasn't named that yet. And go to 1 Samuel chapter 7. But something that the Bible does in a lot of cases is it'll because they weren't scribing this down as the events were happening, right? Obviously, 1 Samuel was written way after the fact of these events happening, just like the Gospels and just like, you know, all the other books in the Bible, essentially, right? It's the idea that it's writing it of things that have already happened. So when it mentions a place, and this happens a lot in Genesis, where it'll mention a place and it'll call it a name, but it hasn't really received that name yet until later in the story, as far as the fact that when they're writing it, it's named that. But in the chronological story order, as far as where they're at in the timeline, it hasn't been named that yet. Now, the reason that I say that is because Ebenezer is a place, and in 1 Samuel chapter 7, and this place is mentioned in chapter 5, I believe, but in chapter 7, verse 11, it says, And the men of Israel went out to Mizpeh and pursued the Philistines and smote them until they came under Bethkar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpeh and Shen and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. So one, it tells you that what does Ebenezer even mean? It means hitherto hath the Lord helped us. So it's basically talking about the Lord helping us. And but I believe that that's when it actually received its name, but it's basically telling you like this is the same place. So and this happens a lot in the Bible where it does this, and I don't want to really spend a bunch of time showing you that. But Ebenezer, this chapter actually has a couple names in it that basically books, stories, and stuff like that will use this name, or Ebenezer. But I think of like one of my favorite hymns, "Come Thou Fount." Hither I raise mine Ebenezer, right? And the idea there is it's not Ebenezer is a place in the Bible, but it means something. meaning like the fact that the Lord is going to help us, right? That's the idea, is like I'm raising my Ebenezer, meaning like I'm raising up like for the Lord to help me. And if you think about it, I raised my Ebenezer because it's talking about the fact that I'm like a sheep wandering from the fold. Lord, I feel it. Like all that ideas that I need the Lord's help. And so, the hymns have a lot of Bible attached to it and things that really you need to know the Bible to really understand what's even being said. But I think about Charles Dickens, and the Christmas Carol. Ebenezer Scrooge, right? And you're like, who's named Ebenezer? But that name's actually a good name, as far as what it means. But as far as literary culture, has taken biblical stories, names, and stuff like that, and it is intertwined in our culture and in literature and all of that, whether the world likes that or not. And when everybody just wants to say, well, we're not a Christian culture or whatever, it's like the phrases that are used, the names that are used, you can't get around it. Like a Christmas Carol is like one of the most famous Christmas movies and stories of all time. And I'm not saying it's biblical. I'm just saying that it's in culture, right? That everybody would look at Charles Dickens as like a literary novelist or whatever you want to say. But it's always interesting when you see names that are used in literature, or you see even phrases that are used today, like I've escaped by the skin of my teeth. And I did a sermon on this at one point, I forget when, but I was kind of hitting on these things that the Bible mentions, like scapegoat. Obviously, I'm trying to think. There's different phrases that are just used all the time. And what people don't realize is that it actually comes from the Bible. Not only does it come from the Bible, it comes from the King James Bible. It comes from the English Bible. And that basically it's intertwined in our culture, and you can't really get around it. But all that to say is that I believe that place was named later on, but obviously when you're writing down the story, it's like everybody knows Ebenezer because it's already named that at the time that they're writing it. This happens a lot in Genesis. This happens a lot in the Bible where it'll state that. And sometimes it'll tell you like it was called Luz, like it talks about like Bethel, but then it was called Luz, before that. It'll tell you what it was called before. 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 3, I want you to notice the mentality of Israel. And you may say, well, you're just reading into this. But when I'm reading through here about the fact that they lose this battle, right? And so what's their answer? Or what's their response to losing this battle? In verse 3 it says, and when the people were come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, wherefore hath the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? And so at least they realize, like, hey, there's a problem here. Like, the Lord's not on our side. But it says, let us fetch the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh unto us, that when it cometh among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. So let me ask you a question. Who or what are they saying is going to save them? The Ark of the Covenant. They're kind of missing the whole point, right? It's God that's going to save you. The Ark of the Covenant is obviously, something that represents something in heaven. Obviously, there's a lot of godly representation of the Ark of the Covenant. But notice the it, when it cometh among us, and when it will save us. So the Ark, when the Ark's here and it's among us, it's going to save us. So it's like this inanimate object is going to be what saves us. So you can kind of see obviously we know that Israel's in a low spot, spiritually speaking, but you can kind of just see it by what they think is going to save them and all that. Okay. Now, the ark is brought out of Shiloh, and notice what it says in verse 4. It says, so the people sent to Shiloh, that they might bring from thence the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth between the cherubims. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were with the ark of the covenant of God. So the people are saying, like, bring it here, and it's going to save us. And now you got two reprobates that are bringing it to you. Like, I mean, it just gets worse as you go down the line. You have two sons of Belial that are bringing the ark, and so it's not a good setup. It's basically just fit for disaster. But I do kind of want to just talk about Shiloh, okay, this place Shiloh. And where is Shiloh? Well, go to Judges chapter 21. It's obviously in Israel, but where at in Israel? Judges 21 and verse 19, because this Shiloh is where the tabernacle was at when Joshua, if you think about when they come into Canaan, they set up the tabernacle in Shiloh. Now, we all know where the temple ends up being ultimately, right? It's on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, right? That's where Solomon builds the temple, all of that, right? And I'm going to get to that, but I want you to see here, it says in Judges 21, it actually tells us kind of exactly the location of where this is at. It says in verse 19, it says, "Then they said, Behold, there is a feast of the Lord in Shiloh yearly in a place which is on the north side of Bethel, on the east side of the highway that goeth up from Bethel to Shechem, and on the south of Lebanah." So it's kind of like, here's where it's at, right? It's in north of Bethel, it's on this highway, but it's the east side of this, So it's kind of telling you the exact location where this is at. Now, Bethel is in Ephraim. And if you think about it, you kind of know it's in the northern portion of Israel, because where were the two calves of Jeroboam put? Bethel and Dan, right? Those are the two places they were put. So I always remember it that way as far as like where it's located. I know it's not in Judah. But Bethel it's really close to Bethel. It's just north of Bethel. But if you think about it, Bethel is the place where Jacob, he sees that vision of the ladder and the angels ascending and descending upon it. And he sets up that pillar, calls it Bethel because it's the house of God, all that. And so we kind of know the area. But the thing to think about too, or the thing that I want to mention here, and I'm not really going to get too deep into this, but Shiloh is a place, and it's the first place where the tabernacle was set up in Jerusalem. But Shiloh is also a name given to the Lord Jesus. It's a prophecy, but go to Genesis chapter 49. Genesis chapter 49. And this may be a sermon for another day to really kind of get into, the foreshadowing or the idea of, the place Shiloh compared to why Jesus is called Shiloh. But that's not happening tonight. I just want to show you that there's Shiloh the place, and then there's this prophecy of Jesus. So in Genesis 49 and verse 8, it says, "Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down. He couched as a lion, and as an old lion, he shall rouse him up. Who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet." Notice this, "until Shiloh come. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be, binding his foal unto the vine, and his ass's colt unto the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine, and his teeth white with milk." Now, I don't have time to get into that. Obviously, this talking about Jesus coming on the colt in his first coming, but then he's also going to be coming on a white horse with a vesture dipped in blood. But until Shiloh comes, so you think about it, there's always going to be a king and a lawgiver for Judah until Shiloh come. And if you think about it, there was a king in Judah until Jesus came. And now Jesus is that seed of David sitting upon a throne forever and ever. And so Shiloh is a person, it's a name given to Jesus, but also it's just interesting on the fact that was the first location for the tabernacle. Now, and that's just, you're saying, does that have a lot of relevance to what we're talking about? I just think it's interesting when you think about the place That's where the tabernacle was at. What does the tabernacle represent? Obviously, going through Exodus, we saw a lot of the representations of Christ and what he was going to do and all of that. And maybe more so looking into the fact of why he's called Shiloh. But 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 5. Notice what it says here. It says, "And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth rang again." So basically, I mean, when the ark gets there, it's just so loud that the Philistines here are going to actually get scared. So notice what it says here. It says, "And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, 'What meaneth the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews?' And they understood that the ark of the Lord was come into the camp." Now, I want you to note here, it doesn't say when they came into the camp of the Jews. And I'm just kind of defining terms tonight a little bit. But you won't actually see that term Jews until you get into 2 Kings, where you have a split in the kingdom, and you have the fact that you have Judea and northern Israel. But what you will see is Hebrews. And even in the New Testament, that term is used. Hebrew. So Moses, Hebrews, like all of that, right? Even Paul says, "I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews." He doesn't say, "I'm a Jew of the Jews." Now, obviously, Judea and Judah, that was just a name to be associated with that. But, I just kind of want to point out those things when people are just like, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. No, it says the Hebrews. And it says they understood that the ark of God was come into the camp. Notice in verse 7, "And the Philistines were afraid. For they said, God is come into the camp. And they said, Woe unto us, for there hath not been such a thing hithertofore. Woe unto us! Who shall deliver us out of the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness." So obviously they don't have a full understanding, they have this polytheistic type of understanding of God. And they know what happened in Egypt. Now I want you to think about how long ago that was. Right? We're in 1 Samuel, and there's like 450 years that have gone by since then, at least, that have gone by since those events. So you're probably closer to like 500 years that has gone by, and they're remembering this is the God that smote the Egyptians and did all this, and they're like, we're in trouble. And so they were afraid of what was going to happen. Now, the Philistines end up strengthening themselves, so this actually backfires for the Israelites, because they're all excited, they're getting excited, and they're just like, the Philistines are so afraid, they're like, we better do something. Like we're going to get destroyed. We better, lace up the bootstraps, gird up our loins, right? Because notice what it says in verse 9, it says, "Be strong and quit yourselves like men, O ye Philistines, that ye be not servants unto the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Quit yourselves like men and fight." And the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten. And they fled every man into his tent, and there was a very great slaughter. For there fell of Israel 30,000 footmen, and the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. Now, the thing that I think about here is there's a lot of stories in the Bible where God will basically smite the hearts of, when they took Canaan to begin with, right? He kind of smote their hearts to where they didn't have any courage. But that's not it. It's not just that for the reason why Israel was victorious. And other times in the Bible with the kings, he would do certain things and they would hear battle. They thought there was this great army out there. You think of Gideon. You think of just other cases in the Bible where this happened. And it's not just that you make them afraid, to where like, oh man, we're in trouble. We're about to die. Like that's not the end game. Like if you just do that, that's not enough. So all those cases where, let's say, you're dealing with the Midianites, or you're dealing with other armies, or the Assyrians, or different things like that throughout the Bible where God has this great victory. Know this is that when God scares them, that's the beginning. That's part of it, but that's not the end game. Because you could look at that and be like, well, let's just figure out a way to scare them, right? If you're a general, you read these stories and you're like, okay, we just need to figure out a way to make them afraid, like kind of trick them to be afraid. But listen, if you don't have the Lord on your side, it doesn't matter how scared they are, you're not going to win. And so this is a case where they were afraid. They were afraid that they were going to be the servants of the Hebrews, and they ended up winning. And so we have to remember that it's not just like, because some people would read through the Bible and be like, well, it's just tricks, and that's how they won that battle. No. The Lord obviously caused them to be their hearts to melt, but on top of that, the Lord was there with them in battle. And so you can't just look at it as far as, well, if we trick them, then we don't really need the Lord on our side. No, you need the Lord on your side. And obviously the Lord is very wise and knows how to, he's a great commander when it comes to war to figure out how to beat big numbers. Now, it says here that there fell 30,000 footmen. So total in this battle is 34,000 men. Now it says footmen, there may be more, right? I mean, sometimes when it shows you that little bit of like specific details, maybe there was horsemen, maybe there was others that died. So I would say at least 34,000 people died, like men died in this Philistine battle. But on top of that, Hophni and Phinehas were slain, and not sad about that. But the Ark of God was taken, and that's really where, in the rest of the chapter here, you're really dealing with that's the big deal, is that the Ark of God was taken. Now, I want you to think about this. The Ark of God never goes back to Shiloh. Actually, in the next chapters that we get into, it's going to kind of shift from being in the Philistines to other places, and ultimately, it's going to go to Jerusalem. Right? That's the ending place. David brings it into Jerusalem, and we'll get to that story where that happens. But it never goes back to Shiloh. So when it leaves Shiloh, it's done. It's out of Shiloh. It's departed out of Shiloh. So this is kind of like this finale of where it was up there in that place, and Shiloh was being blessed with that. And you'll kind of see that where the Ark of the Covenant is, when it goes into Obed-Edom's house, he's blessed. And we'll get into those stories when it comes to the Ark. So this isn't the end of dealing with the Ark of the Covenant, but the Ark of God is taken, and the news comes back to Eli. So when it comes to this, Hophni and Phinehas, I'm not really getting into them as much because they die, and that's what God said was going to happen. And it's fulfilling Scripture. It's fulfilling what God said would happen. But in verse 12, we see that the news comes back about what happened in this battle. And it says in verse 12, it says, "And there ran a man of Benjamin out of the army and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes rent and with earth upon his head. And when he came, lo, Eli sat upon a seat by the wayside watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told it, all the city cried out. And when Eli heard the noise of the crying, he said, What meaneth the noise of this tumult? And the man came in hastily and told Eli." So basically, this man's coming in, he's telling everybody, and everybody's just like crying out. They're hearing this news, and Eli still doesn't know what's going on. He's like, what's going on? What's happening? And then he comes into Eli and says, now Eli was 90 and 8 years old. So, he's an old man. Even back then, 98's old. We're not like pre-flood where this would not be old. But 98 years old, it says, and his eyes were dim that he could not see. And the man said unto Eli, I am he that came out of the army, and I fled today out of the army. And he said, What is there done, my son? So you can imagine, the guy can't see. He's pretty much like, I got to tell this guy exactly who I am. He doesn't know. Imagine you came out of an army, you got blood all over you, all this stuff. You kind of figure it out if you could see. But I'm just imagining, like, he can't see anything, all this stuff, and he's like, basically like, hey, listen, just so you know, I came out of the army, all this stuff. And he's basically, obviously Eli wants to know what's going on. It says in verse 17, and the messenger answered and said, Israel's fled before the Philistines, and there hath been also a great slaughter among the people, and thy two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God is taken. And it came to pass, when he made mention of the ark of God. Now, that's the thing that just kind of sticks out to me, okay? He just said, like, all these people there was this big slaughter, his sons were killed, but it was when the ark was mentioned. And notice that's what he was thinking about, too. Before this guy came, basically it talks about how his heart trembled for the ark of God. And so that's really what his main concern was. And it says here that it came to pass, when he had mentioned the ark of God, that he fell from off the seat backward by the side of the gate, and his neck brake, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. So if you do some math there, he was 58 years old when he started judging, which is interesting, and the fact that that's when he started and all that. But the idea here is that he obviously fell back out of his chair, and he was old, but he was also heavy. And that's just something that's interesting there when it comes to this, because if you look back at 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 29, there's something that God says, or basically God speaks to the man of God. The man of God tells Eli, basically this judgment is going to come upon him. But notice what it says here. It's 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 29. It says, wherefore kick ye at my sacrifice, and at mine offering, which I have commanded in my habitation, and honorest thou thy sons above me, to make yourselves fat with the chiefest of all the offerings of Israel my people. So notice that it says yourselves. So he's talking to Eli. So it's not like he's just saying your sons made themselves fat. Because we kind of already know that they were just taking advantage of these sacrifices, all this stuff. But Eli also was making himself fat from these sacrifices. And so when you see this, that he fell back, he was, one, old, but he was also very heavy. But why was he heavy? That it just kind of adds to that. But we see here that Eli dies, his sons are dead, and so there's a lot going on here. And when the ark of God is taken, I want you to think about this. Throughout these chapters, what do we see? We see that there's no open vision. The Lord's not speaking to Eli. The word is precious in those days, all of that. And what does that ark, obviously there's just a physical application of the ark is taken away from them, right? But when you think about the ark, you can obviously think about the blood being sprinkled on the ark, on the mercy seat. But I want you to look at, when you're dealing with the fact that God spoke from between the cherubims, from the mercy seat. And it's really just kind of showing you this finale that, like, hey, Eli's dead, Hophni and Phinehas are dead, and the ark is taken from Israel. That's the state of affairs, and it just physically represents how all that's been taken away from Israel. Like the priests and the Ark of the Covenant, God speaking to them. Now we know the backdrop because Samuel's there, right? It's always like this idea of, you have Eli, you have his sons, but Samuel. And even the chapter starts off with the fact that, the word of Samuel came to all Israel. So it kind of starts off with that, but then you have this, all this terrible stuff happening. And in Leviticus chapter 16, I just wanted to kind of just show you this, that God spoke to Moses from the mercy seat in the tabernacle. So in Leviticus chapter 16 and verse 1, it says, and the Lord spake unto Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they offered before the Lord and died. If you remember that story, it's when they offered that strange fire, and they died. So it's kind of similar if you think about it, and the fact that Eli's two sons died, and all that. Anyway, it says in verse 2 here, it says, and the Lord said unto Moses, speak unto Aaron thy brother, that he come not at all times into the holy place within the veil before the mercy seat, which is upon the ark, that he die not. For I will appear in the cloud upon the mercy seat. So think about the fact that he's appearing there. It's kind of showing you like the presence of the Lord is departing from Israel. And this finale of this happening, Numbers chapter 7, go to Numbers chapter 7, verse 89. Numbers chapter 7, verse 89. I mean, think about this. The ark has been there since the wilderness. And all of a sudden it's gone. I mean, hundreds of years they've had this ark there. And now it's gone. Now, in Numbers chapter 7, verse 89, it says, "And when Moses was gone into the tabernacle of the congregation to speak with him, then he heard the voice of one speaking unto him from off the mercy seat that was upon the ark of the testimony, from between the cherubims, and he spake unto him." So God was speaking. He was appearing there, and he was speaking from there. So now think about the fact of the ark being taken away from Israel. It's like you're taking away the fact that God is speaking to you and his presence is there. And you can think about why everybody's lamenting that. Now, obviously, I'm sure there's people that are just lamenting it because of the ark itself, right? I mean, they're basically like, when it comes here, then it's going to save us, all that. Because you can definitely see how people will elevate the actual physical inanimate object above God. Because that's just a typical thing that people do, is they want that tangible item that they're holding on to more than, obviously, God, who's invisible. Now, when it comes to the mercy seat and all of that, the Bible talks about in Hebrews, and think about this too, the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there when Jesus was in the temple when he was here on the earth in the flesh. And in Hebrews, when it's talking about the tabernacle, it talks about the first tabernacle, but then it talks about beyond the veil is the second tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all. And it talks about the Ark of the Covenant, and in Hebrews 9:5 it says, "And over it the cherubims of glory shadowed the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly." And so, like, we don't have that today. They didn't have it, I don't believe even Paul, who's writing under the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, can't speak about it particularly. Now, in Revelation, it talks about the Ark of the Covenant that's in heaven and the temple that's in heaven. So I'm not saying we'll never see it. We'll see the real thing. But as far as that physical one that was made in the wilderness that they had in the temple, we can't speak particularly about that. And there are certain things in the Bible that we just can't speak particularly about. Like that they saw, but, And what you have to probably realize with that is that if we can't speak particularly about it, then it's not something we really need to know. You think about, like, the fact of, like, I'm actually planning on doing a sermon about angels and devils and just kind of getting into, like, angels and the fallen angels and just kind of getting into that realm. But you also have to be careful with that type of stuff because you don't want to speak of things you don't understand, right? And it actually even tells you that they speak of those things which they know not, and you don't want to go beyond what's given to us as far as what we know. And you say, well, is there more to know about it? I guarantee there's more to know about it. But now we look through a glass darkly, and the idea is that there's some things that we glean a little bit, and we're like, okay, I kind of see that, I kind of see the big picture of that, but I can't see the particulars of it, right? I can't see all the details of it. And one day, I believe we'll be able to see the Ark of the Covenant and be like, that's what it looked like. And I have a feeling it's not going to look like the one on Indiana Jones. It's probably going to be similar in the idea of, like, the shape of it and all that stuff. But there's a lot of things where you're going to see it and you're going to like, that's not what I thought. Have you ever, like, met somebody that you've only talked to on the phone? And you hear their voice, and you got a picture in your mind? I just did this recently. There was, like, this architect that I was talking to, and I talked to him for years. I don't know if I think he is an architect. Anyway, I talked to him for years, and in my mind, I had this picture of what he looked like. In my mind, he was a goofy-looking guy, okay, just to give you Like, I'm just like picturing this kind of goofy looking guy. And then I met him finally, and I'm like just shocked. Because he wasn't goofy looking. He was like a good looking guy, like that like, but the words that were coming out of his mouth and how he said it, I'm like, that's the guy. It just doesn't match the face. All I'm saying is that, like, I believe there's going to be a lot of things that we're gonna in our minds. If you've ever read a book, and you're kind of picturing what something should look like, and then someone makes a movie about it, and you're like, that's not what it looked like in my mind. The book is always better. But obviously, the real thing's going to be better with the Bible. But I just think about that type of stuff. When it comes to the Ark of the Covenant, we're going to be dealing with the Ark of the Covenant in these chapters and throughout 1 Samuel and going into 2 Samuel and all that stuff. But and there's definitely a lot to be preached about the Ark of the Covenant as far as what it represents. But there's just a lot of things that we're just not going to know the particulars about. And so just kind of wanted to touch on that because that's something that translates to all different areas in the Bible besides just the Ark of the Covenant. When it comes to the Ark, what did the Ark exactly look like? And when I'm talking about the Ark, like Noah's Ark, right? What did that exactly? Well, we know the dimensions, but what did it look like exactly? And we could all guess about it, but we're not going to know. I do believe that we'll be able to see those type of things. Hopefully God will be able to look into the past and see like the parting of the Red Sea and like see these things. I think that would be cool. But anyway, going on, 1 Samuel chapter 3, go to 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 11. I just want to point out that the Lord is performing what he said it would happen to Eli and to his family. And notice what it says here in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 11. 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 11, this is where the Lord is speaking to Samuel, and it says, "The Lord said to Samuel, Behold, I will do a thing in Israel, at which both the ears of everyone that heareth it shall tingle." Now I want you to think about this. When they came back in, what was the big thing? They were all crying with a big shout, all this stuff. There's a lot of commotion that when they heard the noise of what was going on. Now when you're reading this, you don't hear that the ark is taken, do you? Right? When you're reading through what's going to happen, it's all about Eli and his sons and his household and everything. But here it says, I will do a thing in Israel. What thing do you think he's talking about? I think it's probably talking about the ark being taken. And so, when you hear this, you're like, there's going to be a thing that's going to be done. What is it? And obviously we have the next chapter, so we see what that is. But I believe that's what it's talking about. And then it goes in verse 12, it says, "In that day I will perform against Eli all the things which I have spoken concerning his house. When I begin, I will also make an end." So think about it. Same day, what was said to Eli? Your sons are going to die. Right? Hophni and Phinehas are going to die. Well, on the same day, what happened? The ark was taken. That's kind of like the big thing. I mean, I guess you could say like the slaughter, that could be part of the thing that they would be thinking about. But what is everybody mentioning after this whole thing? Are they mentioning Hophni and Phinehas? I mean, they're kind of mentioning them just for the fact that it happened. But you know what the thing that's being brought up? The ark is taken. The ark is taken. The ark is taken. Because we haven't got to Phinehas' wife. But she's not lamenting that her husband died. She's talking about the ark being taken. That's the whole premise. So I think that's really what the thing that was going to be done, to where everybody hears it, their ears are going to tingle. In verse, go to 1 Kings chapter 2. 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 26. You're like, what are we doing in 1 Kings? Sometimes God starts punishing somebody, or sometimes there's a delay on it. Now, in this case, his son's dying. That happened that day. The ark was taken. But the idea, if you remember, about the fact that there's not going to be an old man in the house of Eli, right? It's not saying that, it doesn't say that there's no one going to be born or anything like that. It's just basically like no one's going to basically be in the office or live to this old age. Like there's not going to be an old man, all this different stuff, right? I want you to think about how this keeps going, even into Solomon's reign. Notice what it says in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 26. I know we're not talking like hundreds of years later, right? But still, you're in Solomon's reigning. It says in verse 26 here. It says, "And unto Abiathar the priest said the king, Get thee to Anathoth unto thine own fields, for thou art worthy of death. But I will not at this time put thee to death, because thou bearest the ark of the Lord God before David my father, and because thou hast been afflicted in all wherein my father was afflicted." Verse 27. "So Solomon thrust out Abiathar from being priest unto the Lord, that he might fulfill the word of the Lord which he spake concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh." So notice how that's like still going on. It's not like he forgot about it, and Solomon is doing that, and it's actually fulfilling. Now, there's kind of other reasons why he's doing it, as far as getting into the story with Solomon and Abiathar, and this is where Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, is just cleaning house. If you know the story, he's just like killing Joab. He's just killing all of David's enemies after David dies, and he just you don't want to mess with that guy. But that judgment is still being put out. How about the Amalekites, right? The Amalekites, there was a curse put upon them because they were killing those that were faint in the wilderness. And there was a curse put upon them that they were going to be all wiped out. That still hasn't been fulfilled yet. And that's actually how Saul gets in trouble. King Saul gets in trouble because he doesn't fulfill it to the T. So notice the delay on that. Hundreds of years of delay. And so sometimes when we think about God's judgment or him performing that which he's stating, we could look at it and be like, man, is it going to happen? Like, it's been a couple days. You know, like in our minds, we're like that impatient, right? But think about like how hundreds of years later is when he fulfills that, when it comes to the Amalekites. But then when you think about this, that it's still going on. It's like, I haven't forgotten about that. Like Eli's house, still haven't forgotten about it. You know, and you're talking, 80 years later or whatever it was, probably more, because Saul reigned for 40 years, David reigned for 40 years, and I don't know when this event, there was time between this and when Saul started reigning, so you're getting close to 100 years or something like that, and it's still like, nope, you're still being judged. Now, go down to verse 19 of 1 Samuel chapter 4, and we have Phinehas' wife here. And it says in verse 19, and his daughter-in-law, so obviously we're talking about Eli, because Eli just died. So a lot happens today. She's going to die. So Hophni, Phinehas, Eli dies. Phinehas' wife dies, giving birth, that we're going to see here. The Ark of God is taken. We're talking about just getting annihilated. And then 30,000 men died that day in battle. So, this is quite the catastrophe. In verse 19 it says, and his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was with child, near to be delivered, and she heard the tidings that the ark of God was taken, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, and she bowed herself and travailed, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women that stood by her said unto her, Fear not, for thou hast borne a son. Now, we know that she dies because it says about the time of her death, so obviously that means it has to be somewhere about this time, right? But basically, you're going to be born of this, it says, For thou hast borne a son, but she answered not, neither did she regard it. Now, reading through this, because then it later on talks about the child being named and everything, and you may look at this and be like, well, if she didn't regard it, did she die? Like when they said this? I don't think she's dead yet. I think the reason why I say that is because it says women. The women said that to her. But then it says, and she named the child Ichabod. So to me, that has to go back to Phinehas' wife. Because you're dealing with a singular pronoun of she. because it didn't say like the woman said unto her or something like that. If it said that, I would maybe be saying, well, maybe it was this woman that delivered the child that just named it, right? But I don't think so. I think that the woman names the child. The woman, Phinehas' wife, names it. It says she named the child Ichabod, saying the glory is departed from Israel because the ark of God was taken and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, the glory is departed from Israel, for the ark of God is taken. So the last thing she does before she dies is names this child Ichabod, which obviously means the glory is departed. So a lot of times, I mean, names will have meanings and all that. And again, you kind of have this name that has a cultural, like literary. I mean, who here has not read this and thought of the Headless Horseman story of Ichabod Crane? And if you're not, then you're too spiritual, okay? No. Who here has heard that story? Like 2 people? You haven't heard that story? Are you serious? Listen, we're going to talk about this after the service. No, it's not that important. But it's like Halloween's coming up. Aren't you going to? No, I'm just kidding. No, we don't celebrate Halloween. But anyway, but think about that. Not think about that story, but the story of Ichabod. The story of Ichabod Crane has to do with like some kind of like scary type of horror, essentially. And the person, I don't know who wrote the story. But where do you think they got that name from? And the name literally means the glory is departed. How would you like to be named Ichabod? I mean, that's not a popular name today, is it? I mean, I've looked up a lot of baby names. You know, you get those lists, and you're like in some era of like, what were they naming them in the 30s, you know? What were they naming them in, whatever time? I've never seen Ichabod on the list. I think people are probably more amped to call someone Judas than Ichabod. I don't know. But anyway, and every time I hear the story, I'm just thinking of that story. So that, that's one of those things, kids, when you don't see things that are in the world, it kind of helps because you're not like thinking about, like, you don't have to flush these things out of your mind. And there are certain things when I'm reading through the Bible, I just cannot read this and not think of that story. So, and you adults, if you look it up later, now you're going to think about it. So I'm sorry if I put that in your mind. But basically, when it comes to the glory is departed, for the ark of God was taken. So you think about just how this is affecting everybody, and just the tragedy that's going on. Go to the last thing I'm going to show you here, and we'll be done. Psalm 78. Psalm 78. And like I said, the ark doesn't come back to Shiloh. So kind of the bigger picture to this is how Shiloh is no longer the place where God's house is going to be. It's going to move locations. And I know we talked about this, when it comes to like churches, the kind of, Eli being like the pastor that's failing and not doing what he should be doing, and how the lamp of God went out, and just these different things as far as like the glory departing and all of that. And how it moves locations, right? It's like the house of the Lord is no longer there. And I think about the verse where it says, let their days be few and another man take his office. They'll use that type of terminology sometimes when it talks about like leadership and stuff like that. How true is that, right? Their days, although Eli did live to 98, he died and his sons died. The ark was taken. It never returns, and the tabernacle of the Lord is no longer going to be in Shiloh. But let me just show you where God literally states that. And go to Psalm 78 and verse 56. Psalm 78 and verse 56. I've just never really thought about that. I kind of knew that it was in Shiloh and then it went to Jerusalem, but I never really just thought about that application of the fact that, there was no open vision, like, Eli's blind, can't see, he's fat and old and can't do anything, and then his sons are wicked, and all these different things that are going on. The ark's taken, everybody dies, but then it's moved. It's not like it just goes away. And that's kind of what I want to say is that when it comes to, there's churches that die off. You think about Sardis, right? Thou hast the name that thou livest and art dead. And God's like, basically you need to start doing what you should be doing before you die, right? And so, but there are churches that just die out. But listen, there will always be a righteous remnant. There will always be churches that are taking up the mantle, going out soul winning, just as much as there will always be those that are soul winning. Because the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. And how shall they hear without a preacher? There's not going to be an unbroken chain when it comes to churches and when it comes to soul winners. There might be low points where it's not getting done as much, but there'll never be a case where it goes out completely. God just moves it to a different location. Think about just nations, right? I preached a sermon on the fact of like the branches being broken off and how throughout history, certain nations would pick up that mantle and then it goes to a different nation. And then you see that light kind of going out of those nations. Think about Greece. Think about England. And we don't want America to be like that, but Psalm 78 and verse 56, I don't want to read the whole psalm for sake of time here, but this is dealing with them coming out of Egypt and all of that. But it says in verse 56, yet they tempted and provoked the Most High God and kept not his testimonies, but turned back and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow, for they provoked him to anger with their high places and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. When God heard this, he was wroth and greatly abhorred Israel, so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men. Now, if you look in the book of Joshua, that's where they placed it, in Shiloh. It's very specific, like this is where it's at. This is where the tabernacle is at. This is where they went out from Shiloh. When he's allotting the land and all that, it's coming out from Shiloh. But it says that so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh. When do you think that happened? This chapter, right? Chapter 4, where literally the Ark of Covenant was taken out of there. But you know what's interesting about that, and I just kind of thinking about the fact that they took it out first. Like Israel took it out before the world did. And the idea is that the only way that our church or any church can be destroyed is from within. And us taking God out, us taking the Word of God out, that's when it can be taken out. And but going on from that, it says in verse 61 here, it says, and delivered his strength into captivity and his glory into the enemy's hand. Now, we're going to get into that because these next chapters are actually going to hit on this as far as Dagon and just these different things when it comes to the ark, where it goes. And gave his people over also unto the sword, and was wroth with his inheritance. The fire consumed their young men, and their maidens were not given to marriage. Now, it's giving you kind of a little more information as far as what's going on. Because there's some things that maybe aren't mentioned in here that happened besides the fact that there was a slaughter. But then, what was the state of Israel when the ark was gone? Right? Because the next chapters are going to really be hitting on like where the ark is at and it moving places and dealing with the Philistines and Dagon and all that. But think about the fact that when you don't have God's house there and you don't have God there present in the house of God, and just how you're just not being blessed, and there's curses and there's different things going on there. Now, in verse 64, their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. So, you can definitely see Hophni and Phinehas there, but also in verse 65 it says, then the Lord awaked as one out of sleep, and like a mighty man that shouteth by reason of wine. Okay, so that's kind of what we see in chapter 4, but then God's going to start working with the ark, and then Samuel's going to step up. Right? It's now, all right, now for Samuel's turn, right? It's kind of like, got to get rid of the riffraff, or get rid of those that don't want to follow the Lord, all of that stuff. Get rid of that. It's time for the man of God to stand up, right? But it says here that the Lord's going to shout by reason of wine. It says he smote his enemies in the hinder parts. Now, these next chapters are going to get into this. I don't want to, spoiler alert, the emerods and all that stuff. But he smote them in the hinder parts. He put them to a perpetual reproach. So this is all going to be mentioned in these chapters coming ahead here. Verse 67, moreover, he refused the tabernacle of Joseph and chose not the tribe of Ephraim. Where was Bethel? In that northern portion of Joseph, or where Ephraim was at, right? It says, but chose the tribe of Judah, the Mount Zion, which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like high places, like the earth which he had established forever. He chose David also his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the ewes great with young, he brought him to feed Jacob his people and Israel his inheritance. So he fed them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. Listen, the ark of God didn't come into Jerusalem until David brought it in. And it wasn't until after he was made king and after Saul died and all of that, right? So at this point, it's not in Shiloh, but it's not in Jerusalem. And it's stating here that he forsook the tabernacle in Shiloh, but he chose Zion. He chose David. And so it's just interesting how Psalm 78 just kind of puts that all together for the big picture as far as like the ark's being taken out of Shiloh, and it's going to kind of roam around for like 20 years. And then it's going to eventually, when David brings it back into Jerusalem. So we'll be seeing more about the ark and see what happens to the Philistines when they have the ark and all of that. But that's chapter 4. Definitely some heavy stuff there with Eli and his sons. But we already saw God saying that was going to happen. This is where it actually happens. And so let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the book of 1 Samuel. And I pray that you help us to understand it, help us to apply it. And Lord, thank you for these stories. I pray that you'd help us to understand and see different things in it that we haven't seen before. And Lord, we just pray that you be with us with work. And I pray that you'd bring us back at the appointed time. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.